I want to start this talk from a journey into Berlin. So in the early summer of 2012, I flew into Schönefeld Airport. I was coming from the UK, where I had just started my PhD, and I returned to Berlin to research informal housing. I took the S-Bahn into Berlin, and perhaps some of you have taken it before. It follows the train, follows the east-west divides through a vast area of urban allotments, through these green gardening plots and small allotment huts, just like the ones that you're seeing here on the slide. On that train ride, I kept wondering if people were inhabiting these huts. So, and later other travelers asked me that same question, but in slightly different terms. Are these sites the slums of Berlin? I begin here from this train ride because it allows me to highlight three themes that guide this talk. First, I'm interested in the astonishing traveler asking, are these sites the slums of Berlin? And I take this to imply the question if people house informally in Berlin too. Are these sites the slums of Berlin implies to wonder if the North has moved southwards, as the Komarovs have asked, if Berlin is anticipating developments, is experiencing developments anticipated by Rio, by Nairobi, or by Cairo. If scholars have argued for decades that informality was a problem of the South, this was not only because of housing poverty, we've already spoken about, but it was also because of the presumed failure of the Southern state to properly govern informal housing. As following the Komarovs, we can then ask if understanding how people dwell in allotment offers new insights into the governance of housing in Berlin, and particularly into the working of the state in these governance processes. And this will be my key theme today. But second, recalling Berlin brings the relevance of housing exclusion to the fore. Berlin was a different city in 2012. The financial crisis of 2008 still developed as a crisis of banks and mortgage holders. It wasn't yet a crisis of the rental market. Yet following years of predatory financialization, the housing market was beginning to exclude not only the lower classes, but also the middle classes. So the scarcity of affordable housing, these crises of housing, had developed so much that I was finishing my PhD in a city which had totally begun to reorganize how people were accessing housing across all income groups. It made it necessary to ask a different question, a new question. Are the evicted ending up in the city's allotment plots? Do we see actually a movement into these gardens? As to answer this question, I went back as a postdoc to relate this more conceptual question I had about the South and the North and how you could compare directly more to a question to access and exclusion in housing. So second, this talk will also be about the governance of housing and housing exclusion. And then third, going back to this journey, I'm reminded of debates on Eurocentrism and the Eurocentrism of urban theory and how they've developed throughout these years. It's now been almost 1.5 decades since the initial provocation of Jennifer Robinson's book, The Ordinary City. That critique asked research to account for the experiences of cities in the South as a source of theorization, of provocative theorization. It provoked productive avenues to overcome the Eurocentrism of urban theory, about some we've spoken already today and yesterday. So ways to develop a more cosmopolitan urban studies in which theory could emerge by assuming the experiences of all cities. It has advanced methodologies through which scholars could compare cities. And I think many of us have been engaged in this work. But I would argue that the challenge continues today. Ananya Roy and others have recently argued that Southern theory remains exemplar or exception, and I quote, rather than a source of theory. So I think we can conclude that the critique of urban Eurocentrism has been approvingly received. It's been talked about a lot. But I think we can also conclude that the postcolonial debate is still pleading its case for relevance, to quote Roy again, from the margins of predominant paradigms of urban theory. Looking at this journey, I want to think forward. Robinson always proposed urban study, Southern theory of studying Southern cities, only as a first step towards wider provincialization of totalizing narratives and universalizing theories. But how we can actually be critical of Eurocentric biases and the provincial nature of urban theory while also studying European cities remains open today to debate. So I think there's the question of how to integrate that critique into the heart of urban studies, or a broader theoretical engagement with the core canon of geography. Thus today in this talk, I want to speak about two questions that also guide my book, Housing in the Margins, which was published earlier this year. The first question is how we can research, or how can we research the governance of marginal housing in European cities in ways that overcome the Eurocentrism of urban theory. And here I particularly mean theory about exclusion from housing. And second, how can such approaches help to explain the governance of informal, or put it in brackets here, formal housing in the context of bureaucracies that are relatively well-resourced and largely accountable. So for example, Berlin. And then when I say relatively, I mean that in comparison to the rest of the world, actually. So bureaucracies that are understood to regulate thoroughly and according to fixed rules. It's time to pause here and clarify what I mean when I speak of the Eurocentrism of urban theory in relation to housing. And I refer here to two explanatory shortcomings which I see in the housing debate. So first, the discussion of informal housing, Agnes has just stated this as well, is absent from most housing debates that are, like urban geography more generally, centered on European American suburbs and cities. This is the case for informal housing both in the north and the south. Informality is studied in other more specifically southern debates as if it wouldn't be of relevance to housing. If informal housing in Europe is addressed at all, it's framed as a study of kind of a niche phenomenon such as Roma housing, or as a study of poverty housing. And second, and perhaps more relevant to my epistemological question, American research on housing exclusion remains quite unidimensionally focused on the more structural explanation of excluding from housing, and focused on a coherent role of the different actors, a coherent role of the state, I would argue as well. Thus, the Euro-American debate on housing attaches very little explanatory value to how access to urban housing is actually negotiated in the everyday between actors inside and outside of state bureaucracies. So with these questions and ideas in mind, let me return to the allotments and think through three vignettes that put these questions in context. So shortly after this train ride, I found myself back in the clubhouse of a chairperson of an allotment association and its clerk. I call them in the book Mr. Koch and Miss Wolf. Both also inhabited their allotment huts. And these are, of course, not their names, and what you see on the slide is also not their clubhouse. But these image and other images I brought from the allotments provides an idea of the design of these houses, of this kind of shape and morphology of allotment gardening and housing. Like many others in the colony, Mr. Koch and Miss Wolf were not inhabiting their plot out of acute hardship. They simply enjoyed the proximity to nature and the community that had grown over the years. It was cheaper and it was more comfortable. I should pause here to stress that despite a number of important exceptions, it is illegal to inhabit allotments, in Germany as well. Nonetheless, Mr. Koch and Ms. Wolf only maintained a room in a flat to secure the semblance of legality. So recalling the scene allows for a glimpse into the ways in which cooperation, pragmatism, and negotiation govern the possibility to housing at these sites. When people come together in what I call constellations of consent to establish a relatively stable consensus around the possibilities that exist to dwell. To understand the role of these two gardeners and the governance of allotment dwelling in a more general sense, it's necessary to know that allotment colonies are governed by 4 levels of administration. The city owns the land. It administered it on the level of the district, but it leases the allotment land to an umbrella organization that administers all colonies or all like chunks of allotment gardens in one district. And this district association of allotment gardens then typically sublets single colonies to a local association that administers one allotment colony. So the Kleingartenverein, they're called in Germany. Mr. Koch and Ms. Wolf were heading such an organization. In our interview, I wanted to know how they worked together with the local bureaucracy, if that bureaucracy knew that they and many others in that colony were inhabiting the huts, and how they negotiated to stay put. So Mr. Koch responded, "We get along well with our district mayor. On the quiet, he also knows what's going on here. He would never admit that publicly, for heaven's sake, but he knows what's going on, and he also knows that there's peace and there's quiet here and we don't make trouble. And as long as we don't cause any difficulties and don't go too far, it's not a problem. We also invite the district mayor annually to our festivities, also the councillor of construction." And I asked him, and what does he say concerning your residency? He says he sees this the same way. Going too far or making trouble mostly refers to further illegal extensions of allotment huts, because all parties concerned with allotment gardening are aware of informal dwelling practices, but tolerate these practices as long as a certain balance is maintained. The second item I want to discuss is a plan I was given in an office of an allotment bureaucrat in the city bureaucracy. On the right, you see a photograph of a hut. This is the hut of a dweller who had passed away and bequested this oversized hut to her grandson. The transfer of this hut led to a dispute concerning the possibility to dwell in the hut. I provide this as an example of how room for maneuver emerges and how it is negotiated in the legal governance of dwelling. But I also want to use it to give some historical background to allotment dwelling. The grandmother was one of the few remaining allotment holders who held a dwelling permit that was registered by the bureaucracy, and she also paid so-called dwelling fees. This complicated legal situation goes back to a long history of allotment dwelling that starts with the foundation of allotments around the beginning of the 19th century, end of the 18th century. In Berlin, this history has always been a history of dwelling throughout the periods of rapid urbanization, 2 world wars, and the years of division. Cities sometimes supported and sometimes suppressed housing and allotments. We can thus relate this dwelling permit of the deceased lady, for instance, to a map I dug out of Berlin's Central Archive. This map documents areas officially designated as sites for allotment dwelling in 1923. And it explains why she would have been granted a dwelling permit in the 30s. But having a dwelling permit does not necessarily mean that one's house is legal. The floor plan I was given, you can see it here on the left, illustrates how the building grew over the years. Although the hut was authorized in the 30s and an application for an annex was filed in 57, a further extension was erected in 76 without an official permit. Consequently, the administration demanded the demolition of at least this part of the hut. The responsible bureaucrat told me, this was a point where we said, well, he, the son, has to decide. Either he takes this or the sheds, although the sheds have building permits, but he cannot have it all. It's either or, because a dwelling permit, given the state of construction, we just cannot grant. The grandson had already started to renovate before the bureaucracy arrived to inspect the hut. He aimed, I assume, to improve the qualities of the looks of that allotment hut to heighten his chances to continue to use that property to dwell. Because, as I was told, there was only simple flooring, no insulation, only simple windows, because the entire electric connection was not according to standard, they ended up not permitting the grandson to dwell. My third vignette addresses the complex question of exclusion at the micro scale. I tell this story to provide a window into some of the mechanisms of boundary work that govern access to allotment dwelling. So imagine for a moment the situation of Mr. Fisher a chairperson of a colony who I met in the garden of his hut in a peripheral colony in Berlin. This compound stood out through rather developed housing stock, but although the residential use of these huts appeared to be the norm over that summer, Mr. Fischer made sure to clarify that this was not one of the colonies that were normally inhabited throughout the years. In the interview, he reported of Romanian seasonal workers who had permanently moved into the colony and met the resistance of its members. I will let Mr. Fischer explain for himself. And now we also have 2 Romanians living here, or 3. That is also something where I would say, no, I don't want to have this. No slummification. This does not have to get established, right? It's an absolutely unsanitary arrangement that 3 men are living there. And I asked him if the plot looks deteriorated, and he said, well, when they don't have a shower and nothing to wash, we don't know how they're doing with the toilet and so on. Mr. Fischer was particularly worried about a discourse addressing what was labeled as slummification in the colony. During the preceding months, newspapers had inserted this term into the local debate after Roma family had settled in allotments that were awaiting demolition. This was to make space for the expansion of an urban motorway. These housing practices must also be contextualized into the 2007 enlargement of the European Union, in which Bulgarian and Romanian nationals were granted freedom of movement, yet remain without the right to full access to work. These work restrictions repeatedly led to their exclusion from housing markets as well, and forced many into substandard accommodation or homelessness. But that discourse furthered the antagonisms on part of the gardeners who were themselves worried about the image of their colonies. The resulting pressure of his peers ultimately led Mr. Fischer to order the dismissal of the 3 men. Before drawing conclusions from these 3 vignettes, I want to provide an answer to a question that might now be on your mind. The question, who lives in these sites and how many and why? By and large, allotment gardens can be characterized as spaces of the lower middle class, though allotment holders are overproportionately white. To avoid any misunderstandings, it should be stated that allotment dwelling is not at all a mass phenomenon. It's not like the sites you've seen before. Of the 74,000 allotment plots to date in Berlin, a little more than 1,000, that is 1,140 approximately gardeners, hold dwelling permits. The number of Berliners with other legal statuses is largely unknown. What is called Schwarzwohnen, that is black or unlawful dwelling, absolutely remains an exception. But my research in these sites has taught me to expect at least 1 or 2 permanent dwellers in each of the colonies. And the numbers are much higher at the periphery of the city. Particularly in the northwestern periphery, I conducted interviews in colonies with up to 50 inhabitants. In the east of the city, the process of restitution that followed the city's reunification has caused a situation in which entire colonies are allowed to dwell and own their land, but they lack permits for the huts themselves, so for the material, they lack the permit. And then there are those, and here the numbers are much higher, who move out in March and then they return to their flat in autumn, and sometimes they sublet their flats. And this is called Sommerwohnen, summer dwelling, and it's similarly illegal. And depending on the legal status of the inhabitants, the quality of the huts, we also find widely different biographies of dwelling. You've already seen some, and I'll come back to some of these differences in the conclusion. So with these scenes in mind, let me return to my initial question. How can we research informal housing in Europe in ways that overcome the Eurocentrism of urban theory? I think the most obvious way to answer this question seems to be to borrow from theorizations of informality in the Global South and to use those to think about informality in Berlin. In the last decade, we've already spoken about this. We've seen a burgeoning debate on informality that would lend itself for such a maneuver. A new generation of urban research has deconstructed this binary notion of informality and the state and developed a much more nuanced understanding of the multiple entanglements of these 2 ideas. In particular, authors have stressed the ways in which the state itself acts informally. Most prominently, Ananya Roy has suggested by rule of exception, by suspending the validity of its own order and thereby maintaining flexibility and regulation. Yet despite these critical contributions, these approaches to understanding do not travel well into Berlin's allotments. Roy is certainly right that informality emerges in many cases through processes of dispossession by a sovereign state that rules through exception, but because it casts the state in ways that underscore its flexible and oppressive use of informality, this conceptualization has less to say about the more small-scale practices that we've seen in these three vignettes. So about the more interactive practices of negotiation. To explain these vignettes, we need different causal explanations. Here, informality emerges through the long history of refuge in the gardens, through housing permits and infrastructures that remain intact today, and through forms of everyday negotiation. So I think this is most important, must be explained through the everyday governance of inclusion and exclusion, where the roles and interests of the gardeners and the state are much more fluid than what Roy suggests, and frequently also merge. If this sounds as if to overcome the Eurocentrism of urban theory, I would now suggest to throw recent efforts of postcolonial theory away. I want to assure you that this is not the case. If we go back to the Commonwealth and their call to read the South not a geographical relation, but as an epistemological position or vantage point, theorizing from the South implies in this reasoning to understand the world from its margins in a much more relational reading of the term. To read the world from its margins and understand informal housing through a wider set of explanatory dimensions in ways that widen quite narrow accounts of housing governance I've spoken about. Applies to read informal housing through these marginal registers of everyday negotiation, I would suggest. But how can that actually look like? In my book, Housing in the Margins, I argue that we need to consider the smaller and more dispersed registers of power that also characterize the governance of informal housing. As if we take these points back to the gardens, I suggest that they call for a reading of informality that reads states' governance through its fissures, through the heterogeneity and ruptures of actual governance practices, rather than through the imagined roles of the state, that takes the normative judgments, the social embeddedment, and the subjective experience of all governing actors into account. Somewhat ironically, the informal nature of the state and urban governance continues to be the subject of continuous contentious debate in the context of informality. So as I noted, mostly in debates on the global South. Yet state theorists and also legal geographers across North and South have long accepted the significance of informal relations in state and urban governing. Across these debates, the scholars have already developed a quite nuanced vocabulary of these quiet registers of change, of the small scale and incremental powers of negotiation. This is particularly the case regarding urban elites and political regimes. Tari yesterday mentioned street-level bureaucracy. This work on legal engineering that comes from legal geographies, I think, is the case here. What is missing, I think, is to take that understanding into accounts of housing governance. I've concluded then that the concept of informality does not travel well, but I've also suggested that theorizing informal housing by looking at process of everyday negotiation in the governance of housing would be maybe a fruitful route. I also want to suggest that if we think housing in this way, we might consider the processes I look at as part of the ways in which the state is normally put in place, as part of formality, so to say. Let me then go back to the allotments to see what insights can emerge from such an approach for an understanding of housing governance. Recall for a moment my first vignette about the management of housing through the Allotment Association and their silent but cooperative agreement with the local bureaucracy. Why Mr. Koch and Ms. Wolf were able to inhabit the allotment hut must be understood through the joint arrangement between the different actors involved, operating across the domains of state and civil society. I've called them Constellations of Consent. The agreement that my first vignette talked about indicated that allotment dwelling is dependent on close relations to the city officials. These close relations, annual summer parties and the like, allow allotment gardeners to prove that they live up to the expected standard. In this agreement, both the openings for and the boundaries of transgression are clearly stated. Gardeners cannot overstep them, and although the district mayor knows what's going on, he does not and cannot publicly admit having that knowledge. If the governance of dwelling in the garden is then better understood as a joint, although possibly contested arrangement, that arrangement relies on the internal management of the gardener's transgression. Allotment colonies reconcile local conflicts or neighborly disputes as local matters. They shield legal violations for an outside audience, and they keep their peers in check. Clearly, the resulting stability is not written in stone. Sometimes ovens are removed when illegal chimneys are all too visible. Sometimes people snitch on their neighbors and force the bureaucracy to intervene. But the underlying trust relations between bureaucrats and allotment holders have perpetually normalized a relatively stable realm of tolerance. These processes of negotiation establish a precedent-based order in the everyday. Thereby, they institutionalize the ambiguities in which dwelling is embedded. The presumably unregulated nature of informality becomes a knowable messiness that grants gardeners a relative stability. Recall Vignette 2 and the ways in which the bureaucracy and the grandson attempt to apply the law to the messy circumstances in the gardens. If we consider how the law is here performed into being, as Nicholas Blomley says, the scene points to the spaces of negotiation at the level of legal governance. It illustrates that all actors concerned with allotment gardening mediate the application of the law through processes of meaning making. For instance, the grandson renovates the hut to make dwelling legal. These processes, I would argue, they're not beyond the law, but they're required to apply the boundary between legal and illegal to make the law work and applicable at these sites. But using these legal thresholds, allotment holders and bureaucrats actively widen and deploy spaces of everyday engagement. Maneuvering the law in this way allows to set priorities and to exclude certain practices by designating them as beyond the law or beyond the threshold of legal frames. Clearly, this process is defined by normativity and by competition around the interpretive authority between the gardeners and the state administration. But here it's not the flexible abuse of sovereignty, but these processes of maneuvering and boundary work that become a crucial feature of governance, a necessity to make the law work in productive ways. We need to take these two vignettes into account to understand how these everyday modalities of governance come with their own dynamics of exclusion. Because how exclusion is governed in the gardens can, I think, only be understood if we count for these constellations of consent in which governing takes place, and the ways in which both the gardeners and the state bureaucrats also work through and with the thresholds of the law. As if we look again at scene 3 and the processes of bordering I described, who's able to stay put and who is excluded from the gardens is from this perspective not a result of incessant capital investment or property speculation, but as housing tends to depend on these collective governance arrangements and on how the gardeners use room for maneuver in legal governance, they also define who's able to partake in these negotiations. Seen in this way, my third vignette here describes how a local majority, the Constellations of Consent, closes down a wriggle room of others by defining what they consider to be appropriate. And they do so through the collective work of demarcating social boundaries between local accepted and unaccepted inhabitants. And even without going into a more detailed discussion of this case, I want to stress one more point. The exclusion of the Romanian workers ultimately builds on Mr. Fischer referring back to the text of the law. Of course, they couldn't stay. Housing is illegal in allotments. But we cannot simply understand exclusion through the collective of the gardeners either. As gardeners call upon the law or the local bureaucracy, it is the presence of state power that allows them to draw the line. Or let me put it differently. In these processes of exclusion, some people and not others can employ state power to maintain their privileges. I've argued then that understanding informal housing in Europe and in ways that overcome the Eurocentrism of urban theory can imply focusing on understanding small-scale negotiation. registers of governance that often remain uncovered in structural accounts of housing exclusion. Let me then use the analysis of these three vignettes to answer my second question. How does such an approach contribute to explaining the governance of informal housing? First, it fosters an understanding of how access to housing is negotiated at the everyday scale. Instead of top-down regulation by a heavy-handed state, the case of allotment dwelling permits us to understand how the gardeners are participating in the governance of exclusion, whereby access and exclusion are negotiated through coordinated room for maneuver. State law is here made productive and very normal interpretive processes to make governance work. Second, this allows us to see how boundary mechanisms, here focused on racism and ethnic discrimination, undergird access to housing. But these processes lie not beyond the state, they work with and through the state when dwellers refer back to the law to exclude others from informal housing. So, are the evicted ending up in the gardens? Well, some, but not many, but not because they find housing elsewhere, not because they wouldn't try, but precisely because of these processes of boundary making that govern allotment dwelling. And with that, I want to conclude and look forward to your questions.